this is just a great example of how a transaction can truly be like a win-win for both the buyer and the seller.
On this deal, because it was in the 500 range, we had lots and lots of interest. I want to find the buyer that I know is going to close, right? That's what the seller wants, is a buyer that is going to close. And I've been in the market for a long time, and so have you, right? And so your reputation is really, really important in real estate, where you don't jam people, you close, you do what you say. And I really appreciate Jeff and what his mission is that he's acquiring these properties and he's going to get that lake house one day for him and his wife.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, Colorado, Chris Lopez here, and today's podcast, we're going to do an interesting dissection of a deal. So we're actually going to look into the 8th house hack that investor agent purchased. So we're going to go through the mechanics of how that deal was put together, but also we've got all the main people involved in the transaction on here. We've got the buyer, the buyer's agent, the listing agent, and the loan officer on the property here. So we're also going to take a minute and look at how this transaction is a win-win for both the buyer and seller. I know when I was new to real estate, I had a hard time understanding, hey, if I'm the buyer and I'm getting a good deal, well, doesn't that mean the seller is losing? No, it does not. It comes down to so many more factors than just, hey, what the buyer is looking at, but also, hey, how long the seller's been on the property, and also what type of asset the seller wants to put his or her equity in their move, potentially trade up to a different location or a different asset class or be more hands off. So it'll be a great podcast. And so I've got Jeff White here with Envision Advisors. He is the buyer with his 8th house hack, yes, and also represented himself as the buyer's agent. Absolutely. What's up, Jeff?
How's it going? Doing great. How about yourself?
Doing fantastic. And then we have Jen Reinhardt from Atlas Real Estate Group, who is the listing agent on this property. She's been on the podcast before, a friend of the podcast, and also was the listing agent on this deal. And then we'll talk about how this was helping to fit the seller's needs for where he wanted to take his proceeds. So good morning, Jen.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this will be fun. And last but not least is Troy Howell with NOVA Home Loans, who a lot of our podcast listeners know. So he's our go-to lender and was also the lender on this deal who Jeff used to help get 30-year money from. So good to have you back, Troy.
Good to be here. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, so always fun to talk deals. So we have a lot to talk about. So Jeff, tee us up for why the 8th house hack and then why you like this property.
Yeah, so why the 8th? I'll start the why the 8th house hack. So my wife and I, Suleika, have been on this journey for the last 7 years, and we were kind of getting sick of our current place and wanted to change. And a true house hacker, the way you look at it is you don't settle in one place. You don't get too settled. It does help when you have no pets, no kids. So it's easy to move and look at being more nomad style. But we hit that 1 year mark, actually exceeded it. And what I was doing was looking every single day of the market, looking at every single 2 to 4 unit property, every single house with mother-in-law, every single house with carriage house, really knowing the market of Denver Metro. And literally just wanted to wait to kind of post winter around springtime. And this deal intrigued me a lot because what I knew about triplexes in the Denver metro area is most of them are between, on average, like 600 to 900,000. Duplexes are like 500, 700,000. And then like fourplexes can be 800,000 to $1 million on like more or less like ranges. And some are more, some are a little bit less. This one popped up and automatically I knew it was a triplex right in my buy box, right next to my other properties. So I knew that Southwest Denver metro area right away. And I just knew I knew in 5 seconds looking at the picture, I was like, oh, this is a deal. Right. So before Jen even hit the button to submit it on the MLS system, I was already drafting up my offer basically like 7 minutes later. And it was listed at a price at the originally, if I'm mistaken, around 500. And then she probably got a ton of interest and then shifted it to 525. But I knew even still with that 25K difference, it was still an amazing deal. And then the second question you had, why this deal?
Yeah.
This deal, it's basically, it was in my buy box, in the location I already knew about, in the class that I'm comfortable in, which is mostly C class. And it was a side-by-side triplex, which those are my favorite type of multifamily because the
And
noise.
they're very rare.
Yeah, but usually you see up-down style or kind of, not just side by side. It has a crawl space and an attic, which is very unique. Usually it's just on one level, like a what is that called? Like just one level on a concrete pad. This one actually had both attic and crawl space. So that makes it really easy to do renovations and run new electrical, new plumbing. And you get access for handyman electricians and plumbers and HVAC people. So automatically it's new. And the pictures, so Jen, initially, I think you showed just of the 2-bedroom unit, and that was the renovated unit. So she showed the potential. So it's 3 units, 1 2-bedroom, 1 1-bedroom, or 1 2-bedroom, and 2 1-bedroom units. And the 2-bedroom was fully renovated. So very nice. Did a good job, whoever the contractor was. And the other 2 1-bedroom units were pretty straightforward. She sent me a couple pictures of that. I'm like, yeah, like these are small units. I could renovate it pretty easily to make them a little bit more market ready. And yeah, the only things up front was just trying to get the financing piece. And I know we'll go into that a little bit, but I knew it was deal right away just at the price point of $500 to $525.
Yeah, I'll jump into finance here in a minute. Yeah. And something I want to really highlight here is, part of the reason Jeff, was able to, get this deal in his interest is you hear him talk about his buy box. He knew the geographic location. He knew the type and list off this handful of bullet points. And so the clearer you are in your buy box, the easier it is to filter properties and the easier it is to jump on the right deal when it comes. And you effortlessly listed that off there. So I would encourage everyone to kind of understand, hey, when you say buy box, Jeff just described the buy box and you can see that helped him get this deal. So Jen, shifting over to you, you're a listing agent on here. Talk about the property and also talk about, the move and the wants that the seller wanted to do, with listing the property and trading it up.
So this seller had had the property for a long time. One of the residents had just moved out. And so we had a vacant unit and the unit wasn't in great shape. And so when I get a building and I know one of the units is vacant, I'm like, oh, we can't list it like this, right? We have to get it fixed up because you have to have, when I do a listing, I want at least one of the units to show the potential, like Jeff was saying. We had long-term residents in here and this landlord, he didn't feel comfortable raising the rents. And so the way that this deal was performing, it was around a 3 cap. Now we want the deals to perform around a 5 cap. This is more of a hands-off landlord. So he's not wanting to go in and do a whole bunch of self-managing and fix up and do vendor management. And so he wanted to trade out of the C class into more of a B class, something more hands off. And I see that with a lot of my investors. And it's perfect for someone that wants to come in and live in the property.
Yeah.
Right.
And this is just a great example of how, a transaction can truly be like a win-win for both the buyer and the seller on properties like this, where Jeff is in the phase of his life where he's sweat equity, high bandwidth, and just, he is in the zone for, taking and managing properties. And a lot of times this investors own the property for a long time. As investors get older, they get busier. They usually get more money and they want to have their money work harder for them and less hands-on themselves, which is probably how your investors shifted through. Then, hey, trade up to a nicer asset and a less hands-on asset. And then both investors can be happy from the same transaction. And so, Jeff, one of the things you were saying there is you were searching for, 2 to 4 unit properties, and this was your 8th house hack. My old programming almost kicked in saying, hey, this is not your first house hack. You can't do a 2 to 4 unit house hack because that's usually done for your first property. But Troy, we have talked about this on previous podcasts. I think just about a year ago, there have been some updated lending guidelines that allow people to, can you tell people what that lending program is, and then lead into Jeff's navigation of W-2 to 1099.
Yeah, you bet. The big move was with Fannie Mae. They opened up the door for owner-occupied 5% on multi-unit. Prior to that, you had to put 15% down on a duplex, and you'd have to put 25% down, even if it was owner-occupied for a 3 or 4 unit.
So 15 for a duplex owner-occupied, or 25 for a triplex or fourplex.
Fourplex owner-occupied. So it really took out a lot of potential buyers from that. But having the ability to owner-occupy it with 5% down, meshed up nicely with FHA and VA because they were the only two lending programs that were allowing for that. And you don't get a lot of VA buyers doing it. And really, Jeff has some experience with doing his first fourplex as an FHA because you have to do the self-sufficiency test. And usually what that ends up doing to you is you end up putting more than the minimum down. You end up putting like twice the minimum down.
Yep,
It's like more like 7% versus the 3.5%. So this program upgrade that happened about, I think, November, and we had a client close in December on one of the first ones, has really opened up some doors. So Jeff was all on board and on the hunt at that point, knowing that that was going to be a great viable option, especially having a little more privacy because you can have your own unit and then rent out versus doing all the other potential house hacks of rent by room and whatnot. But yeah, that worked out stellar to do the 5% down. We had you working on some things in advance, right? You gave me a little preliminary tax return because you were transitioning from that W-2. And we wanted to make sure that we were in good shape, that we could perform. Before you put an offer out, you want to make sure you can perform on the contract and really have it boil down to the property more than anything else, and lean on having that come through the way it needs to, and not worrying about the credit, the income, and the assets. So with Jeff's always had stellar credit. He's always stayed on top of that, managed it really well. So no coaching was necessary for that. Sometimes we have people that need to tweak it a little bit, and that comes in handy and helpful, making the pricing better, making the mortgage insurance more affordable, making the property perform better.
But I know and this is kind of like the next level up from there, is I know you guys had some strategic discussions on Jeff's 2023 tax filing.
Correct.
Because, hey, if you're self-employed, there's always the game of, hey, the more write-offs you have as a self-employed person, the less taxes you pay, but the less taxes you pay, the less, that is looks attractive to a lender.
Yeah.
So you were doing a much more strategic one like that. Can you guys talk about that type of review? Because this is something I've been through, but so many people just screw up, to be very frank.
Yeah. Yeah. Jeff had supplied me the preliminary draft of the tax return. So he hadn't actually filed yet, right? Had not been filed yet.
What month did you guys... Was this hunting and under contract? Was it April?
So April is when, so you listed like mid-April, right? Around there.
So you filed an extension for your taxes.
I believe, yes.
You must have. And then
I had to file.
You listed around mid-April. Okay.
But the thing, I think what you're alluding to, so the big take, I think the thing with Troy we dive into more is, so it wasn't just my 1099 income from being a realtor for a couple of years. It was all the rent, all those house hacks I did, the 7 prior ones,
you're
building up. Yeah, so over the last six years prior, building up to that. And Troy, what you want to talk about that? How almost that gave me the ability to qualify more than the realtor.
Absolutely,
income.
Yeah, so that's something we've talked about on previous podcasts and discussions with clients. Is it's not only just the base income that you have, but it's what these other properties are bringing to the table, because they can add or subtract from your debt to income ratio. And each property is looked at individually and analyzed individually. There's a little worksheet that I shared with Jeff that he kind of geeks out on that applies the underwriting guideline requirements for how these properties are looked at. So it's not like, oh yeah, these properties are doing great, they're making money. Yeah, they might be for you, but there's the real world and there's the underwriting world. And so they're looking at mitigating risk. They look at it a little bit more conservatively. So we have to take the information from your Schedule E and plug it into this worksheet just to see how underwriting analytics will look at it comparative to, what's the revenue going to be, the expenses going to be. There's certain things we can add back in to make it work a little bit better. One-time expenses, one-time improvements to the property can help out if we need to, if you have a capital improvement. But long and the short with Jeff is we had to go through all 7 of his current properties, his departure residence plus the other 6 properties, and then factor that in there on top of the fact that he stopped working his W-2 job, was doing just his real estate, and then just make sure all the numbers crunched out. And I think one of the huge benefits, and Jeff and I have talked about this several times, is that he had done his tax returns relatively conservative with his expenses. Like you were talking about, Chris, it's a bit of a double-edged sword because you want to show enough income to qualify, but you don't want to pay too much in taxes. So you're trying to strike that balance. But when we looked at it, it's like, Jeff, you're doing awesome. You don't need to take these additional deductions, or you can take these additional deductions. So go for it. And I think it ended up saving you like $12,000 on your tax returns when you took care of everything.
Yeah,
the
because
full
some of
tax
them I was
return.
almost too conservative, Chris, which I'm sure for you it's like, what does that mean? Too conservative on your tax return for 1099?
We've had many friendly discussions on things.
That might be another podcast for
That's
another
another
day.
But I was almost missing out. So that was great with the underwriters reviewing my tax return before I just had the draft one. So Troy's underwriters were saying, okay, you could still, or Troy told me like, hey, like you're missing out. We won't punish you if you take this one, what do you call it, a one-time expense
Yeah.
for like, I think it was like egress windows. I thought like, oh, that's going to be, depreciated over like.
You're going to capitalize it versus.
Yeah. And I technically could take it as a one-time expense and not get punished with the underwriter. So
For qualifying.
that saved me about $12,000 in taxes just by giving them the draft one so they could see where I'm missing.
Yeah.
So that was huge for me. I was like, oh wow, I could have missed out on that. And I was able to capture that for 2023 and save on taxes and still qualify.
Yep.
So key point here is that like as an investor, especially as you successfully are able to leave your W-2 like Jeff could, because he had built up rental portfolio and built up other active income as a realtor, left it. He was always very conscious of what it does for lending. So always be aware of that. And secondly, make sure your lender is on the same page with you. A lot of lenders won't do the type of depth or guidance that Troy does.
Mhm.
So it's always appreciative that, what Troy does. So those are two big things. And if you're kind of buying a property in that time frame, I would definitely send a draft tax report to my lender before filing it. And of course, talk to your CPA about all that, but it allows you to be a lot more strategic like Jeff and Troy were. Now, I think part of this too, and this is where kind of going back to like the win-win of the transaction, I believe the contract was extended the first time for you to kind of get your taxes finalized, right, Jeff?
Yep.
And then I believe it was extended again for the seller to make his 1031 window identification period longer as well, right, Jen?
That's right. When we did the initial contract, the seller had me put in a clause saying that he had the right to extend it an additional 30 days. And he decided to do that because he wanted to do his due diligence and make sure that he had the correct replacement property. And that worked out for you, Jeff, too.
Yes,
Yeah.
because I was thinking I had filed that extension, but then when you when I did finally file my tax return after reviewing with Troy, it takes a little while for the IRS to recognize it. And then Troy's underwriter needed my tax return showing that payment because I went on a payment plan. That's another discussion too.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
Because you have
And
to get the official word from the IRS website.
Yes.
that
We
you
have to be able to
filed,
pull
right?
a
Yeah, you
transcript
pull it from
to
there.
make sure that what we're looking at is the same that they have on
that's
file.
also a thing. I was waiting, checking every single day to see if it's posted. And obviously, even if you file online, it still takes weeks. And that was also helpful that the seller was flexible there.
Yeah, and I want to double click on that more, Jim, because what you said there was short but very, very powerful. And I mean, it's something you did to really look out for the best interest of your seller on there. I've seen this clause in other contracts where, hey, the seller can extend up to 30 days. So if it's going to close June 1st, you can say, hey, let's close July 1st, for example. And the nice thing it does for the seller is that protects his window for having more time to look at 1031 options, because your 45-day ID window starts when the property closes. So if the property closes June 1st, he has until approximately July 15th to identify it. But since he extended July 1st, it puts him out to approximately about August 15th for his ID window. So heads up for you, Jen, for putting it in there to protect your client's best interest. And I'm curious, is that a pretty common clause you use with your sellers when you're doing 1031s?
It depends on the market. On this deal, because it was in the 500 range, we had lots and lots of interest. And so I could push him a little bit and say, hey, we're not going to do any repairs. We're going to do this time frame. If I only had one offer, or if I had been on the market for a long time, then I wouldn't have been able to do that. And also with Jeff, I'm going to be a little bit more flexible because I trust your team, right? So I think that
Thank
when
you.
I'm working for my seller, I want to find the buyer that I know is going to close, right? That's what the seller wants, is a buyer that is going to close. And I've been in the market for a long time, and so have you, right? And so your reputation is really, really important in real estate, where you don't jam people, you close, you do what you say. And I really appreciate Jeff and what his mission is that he's acquiring these properties and he's going to get that lake house one day for him and his wife.
Yeah,
exactly.
And so it's so important what Jen talked about here is kind of like the reputation or your track record and ability to close. And this coming from someone, you broke over $1 billion worth of, I mean, so she's been around the block quite a few times in the $1 billion range for brokerage transactions. She's seen the great, the good, the bad, the ugly. But I've had so many times similar situations where, hey, offers are similar, but I know you or I know deals you've closed on, either the client or the agent. And I give you guys a much higher probability of communicating well, not, canceling for a silly reason, for getting the finish line. And if something comes up, being able to communicate and figure, okay, this came up. How does everyone get the finish line together?
And also, if you have a buyer with a heart like Jeff, I went and I showed him, hey, this yard needs a lot of work. We have some issues in the crawl space. There's this crack here you need to look at. So as the list agent, I don't hide things. I'm like, hey, here is all of the issues that you might come into. Because what I found is if we have a new buyer and you don't point those issues out, they're going to be like, oh my gosh, it's $100,000. This is $100,000 of work. And I don't know why it's always $100,000, but it's always $100,000. And then my deal crashes and then I'm 2 or 3 months on the market. And so as the list agent, I'm looking out for that seller who can handle and who can stomach this deal because it is C-class, right?
Yeah.
So we want to make sure that the buyer can close.
I love it because you're right. Get out there and show everything because, hey, you get ahead of it, you have discussions, and then everyone comes in there with usually a better estimate.
Yeah, I'm very unsneaky. Like, sneaky is not my keyword.
No.
I'm just like,
Word to avoid.
That's the way to be in real estate. Like,
it confuses people, right?
Yeah.
So.
All right. So obviously you move fast on here, which, hey, the seller liked with the extension, and then that, hey, you could perform on closing. What was the business plan with the property? Because there was some meat on the bones here, and the seller is looking to kind of go from C to B class and be less hands off. So from your perspective, what did you see from an operations standpoint that you could improve?
Yeah, since I knew this property was in my buy box, and I knew what strategy would work best over there, and it wasn't the market rent. So thankfully, the seller did not renew those tenants and just left them month to month. So I knew that was going to be a small hurdle to deal with, but luckily we were able to settle that at the end. We can go into that one later. But so I had to deal with a couple inherited tenants potentially, but the best strategy on this one was easily Section 8, just because the market tenants at the time were $1,000 for each 1-bedroom unit. And I knew that was way under market for what I could get on Section 8. And initially,
were you saying 1,000 fair market value or 1,000 was their legacy?
Inherited tenant rent.
Inherited tenant. Okay.
Yeah.
What was fair market value?
So, just market rent for just normal market rent for what is over there. You could probably $1,400 for 1-bedrooms in that area for sure. Would you agree with that one, Jen?
I would say my numbers are more conservative. Yeah. I use Atlas Manage is about 6,500 properties, so I can look them up. Maybe like 1095 plus utilities, which if you did plus utilities, it might end up around the 1,300. But yeah. I always do the cap rate based on the base rent without the rubs and the utilities, because that's how to be just safe.
Underestimate or not overestimate it, basically, which I agree with that. So yeah, because of the market rents or around the 12, 13, 1,400 number, I was like, yeah, what's the better strategy? How did I know this was such a good deal? Is because I knew in that area, Section 8 would pay much higher. So initially, I went off the fair market rents for that county, which is Arapahoe County, and it was $1,824 for 1-bedroom, $2,201 for a 2-bedroom, because there was 1 2-bedroom unit and 2 1-bedroom units.
Okay.
So total combined rents, so $2,200 plus 36, so it was like $5,800. So simple math, if you look at the bigger pockets rule, that 1% rule, that exceeds the 1% rule. Very simple. And that's how I knew in the 1 minute quick analysis, that's a good deal. Before even seeing, when Jen posted, I was like, oh, wow, this thing, she priced it really effectively that draw a ton of attention. And I knew I had to put an offer in right away and try to get locked up before it hit the weekend, because I knew a lot of other people would see it. So thank you, Jen, for taking my call. And
It's because of Chris.
thank you, Chris, for the great invitation and helping me get this deal under contract before it really got way more attention. And we can go into that part later too, where I was able to get it right before. I would say if you would have held on longer, I think you probably got way higher offers.
But then the buyer could retrade it
That's
down.
true.
Yeah.
So,
And then the seller loses his flexibility for the 1031. So that's where you balance out the win-wins and everything.
Yeah.
And it's not always about the highest and, the maximizing the dollar. There's a lot of other variables in there.
Yeah.
So most I want to highlight here, for, I know a lot of real estate investors out there that, don't always work with, us or Atlas. But like you touched on something, you actually picked up the phone and called Jen.
Yep.
And I know one of my pet peeves, I think you guys are too, is when agents don't communicate to their agents. Send an offer over with no call, no nothing, or vice versa. Like the phone calls communication helps so much behind like just that context and helping to make the deal happen. So just a pro tip out there, if your agents start talking to other agents out there, a little yellow flag in my book. Troy, let's move on to financing on here. Because I already touched on some of the hurdles you were able to help Jeff navigate. And this was a lot of it got started before he went under contract or before he made the offer because he knew he was going to. And so you looked at the credit, you looked at his tax returns, you looked at this before the offer, right?
Correct.
Anything else you did before this offer came from Jeff to Jen? Those are two main things.
Yeah, just doing the application, getting all the documentation to support it, really truly pre-underwriting it subject to the property so that we had all the kinks pretty well ironed out, ready to go. Part of that was, massaging the tax return, updating that. We knew the preliminary tax return, which was a little tight, would work. So loosening it up was going to work just fine as well. So he'd get a little more tax refund coming back to him, that $12,000. Yeah, but just having that managed and ready to go is huge. Takes the focus off the loan and puts it on the property. Make sure the property checks out. So everything had been truly documented and reviewed and just subject to the property. So then it wasn't a big deal. We knew we didn't have to have a rental agreement on your departure residence to qualify. So that made it a little easier on Jeff not having to jump through a hoop and get a lease agreement on his departure residence. Sometimes you need to offset that, but he had enough horsepower, enough income to accommodate that. And then the rents that were currently existing there were reasonable enough because that does factor into your qualifying as well. He's going to occupy one unit, but you have the revenue from the other two units that come into effect and are also tabulated in your DTI. And those didn't have to be spot on either, and because Jeff was in good shape. So he bought well within his purchasing power. So that made it easier for me for sure.
Great. So what were the actual terms of the loan? Because this was the new Fannie 5% down conventional for a triplex. So where did the interest rate land, prepaid mortgage insurance, interest rate, all that stuff?
Yeah, I'm trying to. Did we buy out the mortgage insurance?
Yeah, we pay out the PMI.
Yeah, you did. So Jeff's usually there's a couple different mindsets that some of the clients will have. Jeff's a little more along the lines of let's get in there and make all the numbers work out of the box with the money I have available from the seller credits to what you have available with your funds to get the loan in a great position to perform. So you're not building on the premise of, hey, I'm going to refinance this, or I need to refinance this to make this property perform. You get in there, bought down the interest rates, bought out the mortgage insurance. And so the numbers work and the rents should continue to improve. So it's not a big effect if you never get to refinance it. And especially if you leave the property in a year and a refinance presents itself, it's a whole different beast, right? When you're doing a refinance on investment property versus a primary. And then of course you're resetting that clock. Even if you refinanced in 6 months, you're resetting that 12-month clock because you signed that new deed of trust for occupying the property into the future. So we got in at 6 3/4. You bought that down a little bit. Rates have since done all sorts of crazy things. Since that
at that time, do you remember how was that on kind of par or above what single?
He bought it down a little bit. Yeah, that was a bit below, so he bought some of that down. So a combination of buying the interest rate down, buying out the mortgage insurance, all came into effect. And of course, Jeff has the benefit of being the real estate agent, so he could apply his commission towards the down payment and closing cost as well. So leveraging all the tools available to him.
What was the premium for being a multi again? If it was single family versus multi for the interest rate?
there is a bit of a bump up in that. Roughly, I think it's about 5/8 to 3/4. Don't quote me directly as far as the points go.
That's for the interest rate?
Yeah, just to buy the interest rate, because they look at multifamily as a little more risk. And same thing on the mortgage insurance. That comes in with a little heavier price than what you would have on a single family property. So, again, having some of that figured out in advance is helpful, and knowing that. So like we were talking recently about another client that had his mortgage insurance bump up from what they originally had estimated. That's a little frustrating, but some of that might have been that they didn't take into effect that it was a multi-unit. If you price the mortgage insurance based on a single family, you're going to get, for the same borrower, same amount of money down. You change that one data point on what the property type is, it'll change the price. So
is reason on that because of from the risk of foreclosure. Which one's easier to sell is a single family over a 2 to 4 unit.
Could be. I'm sure there's
like from the back end. Worst case from like a risk point of view from underwriting is if they had to foreclose and they had to sell it in foreclosure, single family is much easier to sell in general than a multifamily.
I would say so.
Like
and I think there's a lot more moving parts to it, but I'm sure that's a factor in it.
Yeah.
And then Jen, I don't know if you can share this, but I always want to go back to like the win-win. So the seller here trading out of a Class C property that is more hands-on, and he was looking to go more Class B, Class A hands-off property, right?
Yes.
So when you get that criteria for the 1031 up leg, what process do you go through, and what type of deals were you presenting to him that, hey, I think this would be a good trade-up for me from a number standpoint, but also fits his criteria from a management standpoint?
With my team at Atlas, what we're doing is we're doing a lot of portfolio reviews. And so we're looking at the current assets of each owner, figuring out which one is performing, what issues we can solve in property management, and what could possibly be a better deal if we were to trade out of the asset. And so with this one being a C class, I know that in Denver, there's a lot of licensing requirements that might be spreading to other counties. The expense ratio has gone up a lot. We're seeing an 85% increase from pre-COVID to after COVID.
On growth, like portfolio wide across the Denver properties, 85% increase since pre-COVID?
Yeah, for expenses. So the expenses are up. Our expense ratios are hitting between 40 and 50%. If you get into class B, C, for C, it's at 50%. And so people are losing a lot of money. Now, if you're going to live in the property and you're going to fix it up yourself, you're going to self-manage, there's a amazing play, right? Like this is a perfect property for doing that. However, for more experienced investor, they don't want to do all of that legwork, and they're concerned with, some of the new laws coming into play, like jury trials for evictions. They're like, we cannot have this kind of risk exposure, right? Because then we're going to have the vacancy cost, we're going to have the expense cost. And so it's just much riskier to be in Class C than Class B. And so I love Jeff right now because I'm doing like 3 portfolio reviews a week. And I'm like,
you got Jeff on speed dial.
Yeah, I do. Because for the investors, I'm like, hey, this is amazing. Go move in there, do Section 8, do your own management. Yep. They're like, absolutely not, right? And so it's a win-win. And I just think that it depends on the investor cycle. A lot of investors are also investing out of state because the landlord laws are friendlier out of state. You have a lower purchase price. And so the barrier of entry in Denver is getting really expensive. However, there's still so much money to be made in Denver. You just have to have more capital.
Yep.
If you're not willing to live in the property, is what I'm seeing.
So are all the deals you presented, were they all Denver based, or were you looking out of state too?
We're looking out of
market?
state and in Denver. I like the areas without a lot of inventory coming online. Mm-hmm. I know your team loves Colorado Springs, but our team does not love Colorado Springs because there are so many permits pulled, so much inventory flooding the market. The vendor costs have gone up. So the values, we're seeing those dip a little bit. The rents are dipping. The vacancy is dipping or increasing. I'm sorry. And so we're getting out of a lot of the areas and moving the capital. Boulder County has a lot of restrictions on building.
Yeah, right? There's no inventory.
Well, and that makes the values
Yep.
high. So they're trying to fix the affordable housing issue, and that's another podcast. But
It's another like
there's
10 podcasts. Right. That we still won't
we're
solve.
pulling
Right.
some permits like in Boulder County right now.
Yeah.
My vendor put in his license and they're like, no, we want your resume. So he puts in his resume. No, we want your resume for all of your subs and the license for the subs.
Oh,
and then it goes through
geez.
this review process. And so if we have a newer investor getting into an asset like this that can't hold on to it while we're going through all of these reviews and the time and the CapEx, like they're drowning.
Yeah.
And so that's why Jeff can have all of our C-Class.
I got the buyers for it, not just myself.
But again, this goes back to take a step back as we wrap up this podcast. It goes back to like, macro trends of the marketplace and investors really saying, hey, at this point in, what they have financially, what they have from a bandwidth standpoint, what they have from like just where they want to spend their time, they're adapting. And that's what creates so many opportunities where, hey, this gen seller is going out of C-Class into a more hands-off, higher property class. Good one for him. Good one for Jeff, who's hands-on, is built in a very good, operating playbook for properties like this. And then I think what we're talking about here, everyone should do it, really understanding what they want to do themselves and also understanding, hey, the market has shifted. I still hear some people saying, well, once rates drop and go back like they used to, guys, that was like 2 or 3 years ago. That's not coming back.
Yeah.
Like, accept this reality and then adapt like Jeff has, adapt like Jen and her clients have, and then go out there and make sure you have a lender like a Troy Howell who can help be a strategic advisor to you to make sure that everything's lined up for you, whether it's your first house, getting your credit cleaned up, or doing more advanced, like, hey, let's massage your tax return here. So Jeff, Jen, Troy, this has been a phenomenal podcast. Loved having everyone in the room to talk about it because it's so much more fascinating this way. So thank you each. And of course, if anyone has any questions or want to reach out to anyone here at the podcast table, contact details should be in the show notes. If not, email me and I'll forward your email along. But thank you guys so much. We'll be back here after some more deals are done.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Chris.
Bye, everyone.